Hello again, everyone. We're continuing on with our coverage of the presidency. There's a lot, of course, to be said about the presidency, and our focus on this recording will be on presidents' personalities, or I guess to be more clear about that, the personalities of presidents. Overall, in this consideration, something to consider as you look over this recording is how important do you find the personality of the president? And I think that's an interesting area to consider. But again, we are talking about one individual, and in our last recording, we focused on the power of the president and those limitations for that power. But certainly then, we can see that that individual and how that individual reacts to that potential power does have an impact, and perhaps personality has something to do with that. Before we do that, how about we look just overall at the identity of a president? And in a way, we just haven't had that much variety of our presidents. So when you consider ethnic background, for example, and this is where, of course, President Obama is very unique to all the other men who've been president. So it's been a very narrow background for most of the presidents. And so you have a European descent, but even there, notice it's been a very limited European descent. It's been by and large what we would consider Western Northern European, mainly the British Isles, some parts of Germanic background. You know, how strict you want to be about judging ethnicity, I suppose that's up to each one of us. But again, someone who would have a Southern European background, such as Greek or Italian, it hasn't happened. An Eastern European background, Russian, Polish, Lithuanian, it hasn't happened. And so it's been a pretty narrow group of people, limited group of people. All men, of course, and then when it comes to religion, notice that it's also a pretty narrow group of people, limited group of people. So mainstream Protestant, what we would more than likely consider mainstream, Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, one Catholic. So it is interesting, though, to say when you look at religion, it's not a requirement that you have to be a member of a particular religion, or in this case, a particular Christian faith. But there hasn't been too many presidents where we could look at them and say they're not really active in a religion or just openly non-religious. We have four that perhaps you could put into that category. So Thomas Jefferson, perhaps the most non-religious of any president that we've had, in fact, quite critical of Christianity. So you can see I have there the Jefferson Bible. You can buy the Jefferson Bible. It's the Bible that has, of the New Testament, that has taken out any passage that depicts Jesus as God. So Jefferson viewed Jesus as a philosopher. And so the miracles were taken out of the Jefferson Bible. As a result of this, his political opponents viewed him as an infidel and viewed him as an extremely dangerous person. It was not that beyond the realm of thinking to have people panic when Jefferson was elected in some circles, because they believed he was going to round up all the Bibles. This was a rumor that he was going to round up all the Bibles and burn them. And of course that didn't happen, but that was the way his opponents viewed him. Lincoln was not a member of any religious affiliation. And so we'll come back to Lincoln, but he's a pretty difficult individual to identify in any category. Grant, no religious affiliation. In fact, it's believed that on his deathbed, he rejected any type of religious ceremony. He just wasn't interested in that. And then we've mentioned William Howard Taft. But in a way, when you think about it, the last one there is William Howard Taft as a Unitarian, again, believing that there is a God, but the God is not active in the lives of human beings, and that someone like Jesus is a philosopher, not God. And Taft was elected in 1908. So that leads us to a question for Chad. To think about where we are now, that was 100 years ago. And I do find this interesting to consider the attitudes of people today compared to, let's say, 1908. And do we think we have a more diverse attitude today than we did then? And yet, here's our question for Chad. Could a non-religious candidate for president get elected today? So could you have someone running for office in which they're asked a question about attending church or their religious viewpoints, and they go, I'm just not interested in that. I don't really have a religious viewpoint, or even to go so far as to say, well, I just don't really believe that. Could someone like that get elected today? So share your thoughts on chat. So now let's go into greater detail about the personality of a president. Does it matter? And that's how I started this whole recording, is for you to think about that. Does it matter? Political scientist that did a lot of studies on personality is a man named James David Barber. And so this is a mixture then of psychology and political science. So let's kind of think this over and look at his study. So there were two traits and 4 categories, as you can see here. He breaks it down, looking at presidential personality. So you have activity level, active and passive, just the way they go about doing the job. And then the outlook, positive or negative. And that then led to 4 different categories: active positive, active negative, passive positive, passive negative. You know, some of the questions here about his study, not every president was part of the study. Barber has passed away. The last president that he really analyzed was George Herbert Walker Bush. And also, do we consider physical health as an issue for why a president may behave the way a president does? And there's a couple of categories a couple of presidents that will bring up that question. So, but it is interesting, right? Not every president, we should assume, has the same activity level. You know, some might work 12, 15 hours a day. Some might work 8 hours a day, 5 hours a day. And it doesn't necessarily mean, and we all know this as well, that someone who's at work 12, 15 hours a day may not necessarily be that productive versus someone who's working only 7 or 8 hours a day. And then we know that some people just have a positive outlook on life and other people don't. And some people are able to let things go and other people aren't, you know, when certain things happen. And so what does that mean then for any one of us and whatever personality or issues we're faced with? But secondly, more importantly, somebody who's, again, since the 1940s has been in charge of nuclear weapons. So there's where we can think about the personality. So let's look at these 4 categories. So the active positive, you can see the presidents studied by Barber that would fit into this category. So an active level and a very positive outlook. We can probably consider that that's really the best type of personality, Barber would say, that a president ought to have. And of course, we can see on here many presidents that by most ways of analyzing the presidency there would be a conclusion that they were successful presidents. Really, everyone on that list. And then you have the active negative, where you can still see what would be considered a successful presidency by most cases, Woodrow Wilson. But yet many of you pointed out when we were talking about the presidency and had in chat, his racist attitudes that Wilson had. And so, which is indeed very accurate. So when you look at any one of these presidents, that you can say they work really hard, but they have a negative point of view, and that can lead to some problems in their presidency. And really for all four of them, you can see that. Then you have passive positive, so they're passive in their workload, but they do have a positive outlook. I think without a doubt, especially Harding and Reagan, you could certainly fit into that category. To some degree, almost everyone liked them personally, maybe had some issues with their decisions and the outcome of their activities, but they had likable personalities. I think everyone admired Madison's intellectual capabilities for sure. And then here you have passive negative. And it's kind of an interesting way of looking at this category that, again, you can see a couple of very successful presidents, Washington and Eisenhower, but they may not really necessarily enjoy being president. So again, the active positive presidents would be individuals that certainly do enjoy being president. And I think people would say that of Franklin Roosevelt. He liked being president. So they have high confidence. High confidence doesn't mean that they believe they're always right. A person with high confidence may know they made a mistake, and then they own it, they wear that mistake, and they make changes. And they're willing to make changes. They're willing to laugh about themselves. Usually that's a really good category, a good indicator of someone who has high confidence. They can joke about themselves. And these individuals, there were indications that they were able to do that. With the active negative, you're talking about someone who's paranoid. So they may work really hard, but they're always thinking someone's out to get them, and it's never enough. They're not able to accomplish enough. Lyndon Johnson, that was on that list, is a fascinating study. He worked extremely hard. He was very busy. I don't know if there was ever really something that beyond politics, that he seemed to enjoy. People talk about him going to a baseball game, and he really would never watch the game. He was just talking about what things were. This was when he was in the U.S. Senate, how to make the next move in the Senate, and not really enjoy the game or anything about the game. So one of the things that you generally see for presidents that are in this category, they are pretty interesting to study, but there is, again, especially in the nuclear age, perhaps a concern to have someone like that in the office of president. With the passive-positive, there's this concern that they're not necessarily directly involved in all the decisions of the presidency, that there's parts being done of the presidency without them really being fully aware of it. That did seem to be the case with Reagan, especially near the end of his presidency, which does raise the question that it's not personality so much as it is health. His own son has said that in the last year or so of his presidency, maybe the last 2 years, that there were signs of Alzheimer's for Reagan. That's concerning for sure. And that you had that type of health issue, potential health issue for the president. But we do, for example, in the history of his presidency, there were reports that Reagan was not aware of some activities that were occurring while he was president, some of the activities occurring in the executive office, especially involving an issue called the Iran-Contra scandal in that case. So they like being president. They have a very positive attitude towards people, but they're not necessarily themselves always in charge. And then passive negative, maybe the only reason why they're serving is because they feel that it's part of a duty to serve. So again, they don't necessarily really enjoy being president. I think there's some questions about that viewpoint by Barber. Here's a picture of Eisenhower. He certainly appears to be enjoying what he's doing there. But that's the conclusion that we can see here from this study. But again, and come back to the issue of health, and especially with Eisenhower, but also Coolidge. He's on that list. Calvin Coolidge was a president in the 1920s, and both of them did have heart attacks. It's more documented, the health of Eisenhower in the 50s than Coolidge, but there's now studies to suggest that Coolidge also had a heart attack. There was a family tragedy for Coolidge while he was president. We can certainly think that that limited his activity. But Coolidge is probably one of the least active individuals that we've ever had as president. By most reports, he would sleep somewhere around 10, 12 hours a day and also take naps. So he just was not an active individual compared to some other people that we've had as president. But for each one of these categories, before we move on, let's just consider, if you look those over, I do think it's interesting that even by Barber's own account, where we say one personality, the active positive is the best type of personality to have, you can have a successful president with any one of these personalities. Reagan's presidency overall is deemed to be successful. So is Wilson's, with some serious flaws there. And they had some personality issues that would suggest maybe they wouldn't necessarily be successful, but they were. The same can be said with Dwight Eisenhower. So makes us wonder, how important do we find personality? And again, one of the most complex individuals that you'll ever study, Abraham Lincoln, and we're left once again when we look at the question of personality, where does he fit? And there's so many cases of saying, just like we mentioned about religion, we don't really know where he fits on religion. He had all kinds of statements made about it, some very positive, some very negative. You look at his personality, sometimes it's been suggested that he was a manic depressive. There was an episode before he was married, and he was a young man, in which his friends had to stay with him because they were afraid that he was going to do something damaging to himself, hid all the knives in his house because they believed that he could be a threat. So you have that kind of indication there about Lincoln. Just an extremely complex individual. And it's worth noting here too, as far as Americans go, but really around the world, I believe, Lincoln in the United States, he is the #1 individual in which books are written about. So there's been more books written about Lincoln than anyone else. In the United States, Jefferson is second, but Lincoln is #1. In the world, I believe that it's about tied between Lincoln and Napoleon. So there's just a lot of stuff to say about Lincoln, and he's a complex, hard individual to fully figure out for sure. And that then leads us to our other question here for chat. Do you think it is important for a president to have a good personality? So here in this issue for chat, just in your entries, put down what do you think about personality? Does it matter? You know, you think about different jobs. Are there some jobs in which having the personality is a key part of that job? So we want doctors, for example, medical doctors, to be very competent, but do we also want doctors to have a personality to convey to us issues about our health and how we may need to change our health or how we need to change the health of our loved ones. And that some doctors are able to do that in a more successful way because of their personalities. And so would you in some ways say, you know, maybe there's another doctor that's more competent than this doctor, but I prefer this doctor because of this doctor's personality. There's some suggestion that this doctor cares and can connect with me, and that's something I want to take into consideration. So how important, when it comes to the presidency, would you consider personality? All right, we'll stop there. A lot of interesting things about the presidency when it comes to this issue of personality. We'll have one more recording on the presidency, and it will deal with the different offices in the executive branch.